Welcome to Mosaic. I'm Erwin McManus. I want to welcome you wherever you are across the world. More than ever, we are so cognizant of the reality that Mosaic is not a place, but a people. It is not a location, but a movement, that we are a global tribe coming together to bring hope and faith and love to the world. Last week, we began a new series based on my book, The Way of the Warrior, and we're diving into the path to inner peace. In the middle of this quarantine, in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis across the world, people have been struggling with stress, with anxiety, with even depression, with panic attacks. And we want to dive into how to secure and develop inner peace. And if you have the book, The Way of the Warrior, you'll realize that we began last week with chapter 1, that the warrior fights only for peace. And today we're going to jump all the way to the last chapter, chapter 8, and dive into this particular concept that the warrior stands in their pain. And we want to talk about the power of resilience today. You know, what's fascinating to me is how the entire human story cannot separate life and pain. It's inseparable. And in fact, this past week, we had this wonderful couple who are part of our life. It's kind of a curious beginning because our son, Aaron, and our daughter, Mariah, they had a friend named Tess. Well, actually, Mariah had a friend named Tess. Then Aaron came back from New York, and then Tess and Aaron became friends. And so then they had this little triad of Mariah, Tess, and Aaron as friends. And then Tess started dating someone named Eric. And then Aaron realized if Tess is going to stay his friend, he needs to be friends with Eric. And then suddenly Eric and Aaron became best friends. And so now you have this quadrant. You have Mariah and Tess and Aaron and Eric, and they've been lifelong friends, and they've become our family. And Tess and Eric just had a baby. They just had their first little baby girl. Her name is Rooney Valentine Roy, and we cannot wait to meet her. But Eric is texting us, or texting Aaron, letting him know what's going on. And at one point, he actually says, I can see the head, but the baby's not coming. And I'm thinking to myself, your family, but that's way too much information. I just don't want to know that much detail. Just tell me if the baby's here or if the baby's still coming. And of course, there were complications, and somewhere along the way, he said they're going to have to vacuum the baby out. I don't even know what that means, but I don't even want to know what it means. And I'm thinking to myself, there was a time in human history when there were no epidurals. There was a time in history when there was no medication really to relieve pain, and women had to go through the process of giving birth without any sedatives. I mean, I can still remember back when Kim was pregnant with Aaron, and when Kim was pregnant with Mariah, and she was going through the pain of labor. And I remember when it was our first child, when Aaron was yet to come, and Kim was pregnant, and she was in labor, and I saw this little machine that would measure when she was in pain, measure her contractions, measure those moments where the pain increased and when it was alleviated. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I said, honey, this machine will tell you when your contraction is coming. And she just sort of screamed at me and said, I don't need a machine to tell me when I'm having a contraction. I can tell you when I'm having a contraction. Women are incredibly dangerous while they're giving birth. And as she was getting the epidural and the pain began to be alleviated, I asked the doctor, do you have one for me? And of course, I am so grateful that the way that we're designed biologically is that we get to be the support system as husbands, but we don't have to go through the pain of labor. What an odd word to describe giving birth to life, labor. Because there may be no more painful human experience than giving birth to a human being. How odd that life and pain would be inseparable. And that remains true throughout all of our lives. So oftentimes we turn to faith in a hope that we could find a way to escape pain. We hope that maybe if we could turn to God, that God would give us a path of life that would allow us to go around pain or to avoid the deep wounds that life can bring so oftentimes. And And yet, if you pay attention to what the scriptures tell us, not only in the overarching story of the scriptures, but also in the story of Jesus, we realize that God has never promised us a way out of pain, but he does actually promise us a way through pain. And if you're going to understand what it means to fight for your peace, you're going to have to deal with this unpleasant reality that the way of the warrior is not a way around pain, but the way of the warrior is to learn how to stand in your pain. In fact, in the opening lines in chapter 8, I write these particular words. It says, the warrior bears their wounds well. Their scars carry a beauty that only sacrifice can create. The warrior never hides their scars. They know their scars are the story of their life. The one who has no wounds has never fought a battle. The warrior trusts only the person who bears wounds openly and wears them well. Some wounds are so deep they take years to heal. Other wounds are unseen, and the healing takes a lifetime. The warrior knows that the battle will cause them great pain, anguish, and suffering. You do not go to war because you think you can avoid defeat. You do not go to war because you believe that the victory is certain. You go to war because you know you must fight. There are things in this life that if you can avoid, you should avoid at all costs. There are battles you should never be in, conflicts that should never happen. But there's a battle for inner peace that has to be engaged. And if you're struggling, even right now, if you're struggling with stress or anxiety or fear or doubt, or you're on the edge of depression or maybe even despair, this is a battle you cannot avoid. This is a battle you cannot run from. This is a battle that you must not surrender to. This is a battle you must take on. Peace never comes by accident. Peace never comes because we've abdicated responsibility for our lives. Peace only comes when we decide it is worth fighting for. So when you stand in your pain, this is when you are in the heat of the battle. It's when you stand in your pain that you realize you're stronger than you knew, that there's more in you than you thought, and that you have the capacity for resilience that perhaps had never been tested before, but was always waiting for the moment you needed that kind of strength. One of the questions I get from people all the time is, where is God in my suffering? Where is God in my pain? Where is God in my loneliness? Where is God in those moments where I feel so desperately alone and isolated that it seems as if no one can find me, no one can reach me? And I'm so certain that this is why God did what he did the way he did it. Why God stepped into human history in the person of Jesus. Why God took on flesh and blood and walked among us. Because it seems so incredulous that God would step into our reality, that God would take on our humanity. Why would God come in the person of Jesus? And then if he would come as a human being, why would he choose the path that he walked? How could his death on the cross be the path to inner peace? I think somehow God has always understood that this would be the deepest human question. That for us to be able to trust God, we would have to answer the question, where is God in my pain? See, when you're standing in your pain, that's the moment you can realize that God is with you. So I want us to look at that moment in the life of Jesus when he was standing in his pain and grappling with the same issues that we've grappled with and struggling with those same dynamics of being human and wondering where God is in those moments where we need him most in our life. In Matthew 27, verse 27, we're told this. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spat on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. And after they had mocked him, they took him away, and they took off his robe and put his own clothes back on him, and then they led him away to crucify him. In this moment when Jesus is facing his accusers and is being beaten and mocked, it would be so easy to ask this question: God, where are you in my suffering? God, why haven't you found a way around this? And I am so convinced that the reason Jesus had to take on that suffering is that this is the most powerful existential question that human beings ask. God, where are you in my pain? Where are you in my suffering? Where are you, God, when I need you most? And if God had found a way around suffering for Jesus, then all of us would expect for God to find a way around suffering for us. And rightfully so. See, if God stepped into human history and found a way not to be wounded, if God stepped into human history and found a way not to be scarred, if God found a way to step into human history and to not suffer, then why would we not expect for God to show us that way as well? But that wasn't the way that Jesus walked. The path to inner peace for Jesus was not a path that was absent or void of suffering. And in that moment when Jesus was being mocked and beaten and brutalized, it was there that we are told he was fulfilling God's intention and God's purpose for his life. So when you feel this question overwhelming you, God, where are you in my suffering? It's important, it's so essential for us to remember that Jesus was already there. See, where is God in your suffering? He was waiting for you in that suffering. You don't need to wait for God to show up in your suffering. God is already there. When Jesus stepped into human history, when he took on flesh and blood, when he allowed himself to be accused falsely, to be beaten and mocked and spat upon and humiliated, when Jesus allowed himself to be stripped of his dignity and his clothes and taken to a cross, that was Jesus saying, I am here with you in your suffering. There have been times in my life where I've had such incredible joy, and I've been just so filled with a love for life. And then there have been times in my life where I've been so broken and I've been overwhelmed with pain. And it would be so easy to acknowledge God and to see, oh, God is here when life is so good. And it's so tempting to question God's goodness when life isn't going well. And I'm so grateful now that I've lived so long and I've had so many different and varied experiences in my life, because I can tell you that so oftentimes when life is going so well, those are the moments where I'm less aware of God's presence. And it would be so easily tempted to forget that when life is good, that's a reflection of God's goodness. But what has actually happened in my life is that God has built a resilience in me that I didn't know was humanly possible. And it's actually in my pain and in my suffering where I have found God to be most real and most powerful in my life. You know, every year that passes, I begin to experience all these physical reminders of my journey. I broke my elbow when I was around 19, 20 years old, and I've never been able to straighten my arm out. And at that time, the doctors that were attending to me told me I might never move my arm again. I might never regain movement. And I have regained the movement, and I can play basketball, and I can work out, and I can live life fully. But boy, I can tell you, the pain in that elbow was becoming more and more intense. And I remember when I was around 19 years old, I was running across a highway, and I got hit head on by a car, and I was paralyzed from the waist down for just a short amount of time. And I can tell you that the impact on my knees that happened in that moment it stayed with me throughout my life. And now sometimes I'm just sitting and I feel the pain in my knees. I don't have to be running. I don't have to be lifting weights. I don't have to be doing anything physical or anything really strenuous. I feel the reminders of that pain. I have all these physical memories. I have scars across my body. I have wounds that have left their marks on me. I have a scar across my head. I have a scar across my stomach. I have holes and scars on my arms and places where bones have been broken. And every one of them is a marker of a moment in my life. I'm not sure why, but I definitely do not trust people who have no wounds, who have no scars. I find people who carry their scars and wounds well, who are not defined by them, but are refined by them. Those are the people that I have the most confidence in. Because your scars are the story of your life, and some of them you can see physically, and some of them no one can see but you and God. But the scars are deep and they're real, and they're a reminder of suffering and sacrifice that you've been through. I have these small holes that remind me when they went in and operated to take out the cancer inside of me. And I have no physical memory of the war that was taking place within my body. I just have these small reminders of the battle that was raging inside of me. And there's some of you right now, you have wounds and scars, not only all over your body, but all over your soul. And those wounds can cause you to pull away from God, believing that he was not there in your suffering, or they can cause you to lean into God because you see him all over your suffering, because he suffered for you and has suffered with you and will give you strength in the midst of that. But not only do we ask the question, God, where are you in my suffering? We also ask the question, God, where are you in my loneliness? God, where are you in my loneliness? And I find that so oftentimes the pain that we experience is less a physical suffering, and so oftentimes it's the isolation of our soul. It's this need to find acceptance and love and intimacy and community and family, and to find a tribe. And this time of quarantine, for many people, is not the first time they have felt isolated and disconnected. This moment of social distancing is not the first time for many people they have felt alone in the world. This time where we're practicing this 6 feet of separation, some people have felt 1,000 miles of separation, even when they've been in the same room with other people. And you may be with me in this moment, and you may be alone somewhere across the world, and yet loneliness is not a new experience for you. It's the common experience of your life. Think, how in the world could God ever understand my loneliness? How could God ever understand my disconnection? How could God ever understand this deep aloneness that I'm struggling with, that I carry every moment of my life? In Mark 15, beginning verse 33, you're told this about those last hours in the life of Jesus. It says, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, and put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. It's to me so surprising, so unexpected that on the cross, Jesus would cry out Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Not that it should not be cried out. Not that I would not declare that or you would not declare that. In fact, any one of us who had given their lives to bring pleasure to God, to fulfill God's purpose and intention in their life, and finding yourself being crucified in the moment of your greatest pain, and while you're standing in that pain, it should not surprise us that we would say, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? Of course, Jesus, when he declares this, is actually making a broader declaration. Because as we listen to the context of everything he's saying, we know that in actuality, Jesus is giving a backdrop for the faithfulness of God. When he cries out this declaration, he's crying out what all of humanity has carried in their own soul, this question of God's abandonment, this question, have we been left orphaned by God, who is our Father? So if you've ever wondered that, you should not feel as if you're alone. God has understood this question. He understands why we feel this deep sense of disconnection. You were never created to live apart from God. And here in this moment when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He lays out that as a backdrop before he declares his ultimate declaration of victory when he says, Tetelestai, it is finished. He wants us to know that in this moment, he took upon himself all of our sorrow and all of our loneliness and all of our isolation and all of our disconnection. And not only the disconnection and loneliness we feel toward each other, but that unexplainable disconnection that we feel toward God. So you may be listening right now, and you've tried to connect to people, and you've tried to find the intimacy your soul is longing for, and you've tried to commit yourself to love. And you know, one of the most difficult things in the world is to have a human being who loves you and a human being you love, and yet still unexplainably feel this sense of loneliness. After all, if you have the most fulfilling human relationships, why are they not enough? Why is it we can find this romantic love? Why is it that you see people in Hollywood, the most attractive man and the most beautiful woman, and they meet on a set, and they're part of a romantic comedy, and art becomes life, and they fall in love, and it doesn't take 3 months before the relationship is over. Sometimes it takes a few years, and ends in heartbreak and disillusionment. How is it that even human love doesn't fully satisfy our need? Is it possible it's because we keep trying to find in people what only comes in God? That we keep feeling disappointed in each other because we keep hoping that we can fill the void that only God can fill. I remember before I had a faith in Jesus, while I was still struggling through who God was, and I had now understood who Jesus was. And I had people talking to me about my need for a relationship to God and how Jesus died on the cross for me and how God was inviting me into a relationship with him, but I just wasn't ready to concede that. I don't know why, but I was just terrified of surrendering my life to Jesus. And even the life I didn't want to give up to someone else. And I could feel it. I felt almost as if I had all this pressure from this invisible force that we would call God. And I was trying to distract myself. So what I did is I called my girlfriend who lived in another state, and I flew her down to spend time with me in Florida so that I could get my mind off of God, so that I could distract myself. And I hoped against hope that she could fill that emptiness, that longing, that void inside of me. And I remember just after a few days, and we've been dating for several years, and I don't think she'd ever seen me express a deep, profound emotion. And one day we were walking through the parking lot of the apartments where we lived, and I just sat down on the edge of a curb and put my head in my hands, and I just began to weep. And she didn't know what to do because she'd never seen me express emotions like that. And I just couldn't tell her that the reason I was weeping was I knew as wonderful a human being as she was, she couldn't fill what my soul was longing for. And it was in that moment that I realized that the loneliness inside of me, the emptiness, the longing, the aloneness could never be filled by a singular human being or even all of humanity. The connection my soul was longing for was the connection that Jesus died for me to have with the God who created me. So if you're asking the question, God, where are you in my loneliness? I want you to realize that Jesus, he bore that loneliness on himself and even experienced what it felt like to be separated from his Father as he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But when we ask, God, where are you in my suffering and where are you in my loneliness? So oftentimes what we're also asking God is, God, where are you in my brokenness? Because what do you do once you just recognize that you're a mess? Well, what do you do once you realize that you've shipwrecked your life and you feel like you've lost so much time, you've lost so many years, and sometimes it feels almost as if it's too late. And what's crazy is I talk to people who are 22 years old and feel like it's too late. I talk to people who are 31, 32 years old and they feel like they've wasted their entire lives and it's too late. I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to people who are at the crest of their 40s, and when they hear that Jesus offers them new life, they feel like it's just too late for me. And so oftentimes, it's not even about time, it's about choices. We've just made so many destructive choices, so many choices that have left others broken and left ourselves broken, that have wounded others and wounded ourselves. And what we find is that God actually teaches us, he builds in us a resilience. That when we face our suffering, we find the strength to overcome that suffering. And when we feel overwhelmed with loneliness, we find the resilience to rise above that loneliness and to believe in love and to make the greatest choice to risk in love. But also to realize that you're never too broken for God to create something new. You are never too broken for God to create something beautiful. You are never too broken for God to not create out of you a masterpiece. You know, in Luke 23, beginning of verse 32, it tells us about Jesus. It says, 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes and began casting lots. And the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. And they said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, if he is the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him and offered him wine vinegar and said, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the king of the Jews. And one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and save us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you are under the same sentence. But we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said, Jesus, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. In this moment, it's this moment of promise in the middle of all the pain. Jesus has been crucified, innocent and yet condemned. And 2 men, one on each side, and they seem to represent the entirety of the human story. One who joined in the mocking of Jesus and was still self-serving and saying, if you can save yourself, then save us. And the other acknowledging Jesus' innocence, seeing that Jesus is more than they ever understood. Seeing that Jesus was genuinely the king he claimed to be and was the ruler of a kingdom they wish you'd all long to enter. He simply says to him, remember me when you enter your kingdom. And Jesus, in that moment, offers that man hope. He offers him the promise of a future. I wonder how many times in our lives we're just so convinced there's just nothing God can do to fix the mess I've made. I think this is why this story is in the scriptures. Because at the very end of Jesus' life, and at the very end of these men's lives, Jesus was still bringing hope to the broken. He was still healing the shattered. He was still bringing a future and a hope to someone who thought that they were simply at the end of their story. And their only future was death. See, the warrior knows there's no way around the pain that this world brings. This life has a narrative of life and pain. When you were born, you brought pain to the woman who gave you life. Your birth came at a price. Your first breath came after a moment of weeping. All of us are born out of the pain of labor and the labor of pain. How is it that for generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, women still choose to carry the pain of life? That mothers still choose that the giving life to someone that you can love is worth the suffering and the pain required. Why in the world would any mom have a second child? Because it seems that every time I've asked moms that question, is that they remember the pain in the moment, but after that baby is born. See, after Rooney Valentine takes that first breath and they clean her up and wrap her in a blanket and hold her close. And when they look at Rooney right in the eyes and they feel her close to them, all they remember is the joy. The warrior stands in their pain and they find the power of resilience, because that power comes in the joy on the other side of the pain. And I wonder if in this moment you're standing in your pain, but you've forgotten that when you entrust your life to Jesus, there's always joy on the other side of that pain. It doesn't matter what you're going through, no matter how much you suffered, no matter how many wounds and scars have marked your soul, God always has this promise of a future and a hope. And in that, we can find our strength. And by the way, that's the promise of the scriptures, that the joy of the Lord is our strength. In the middle of our pain, let's hold on to the joy that is waiting for us on the other side. You may be here right now and you're standing in your pain. You may be listening in this moment saying, I need God in my life. You may be here in this moment wondering if it's too late for you. And I want you to know that this moment can be the beginning of new life for you. This moment can be the beginning of a new story. This moment can be the beginning of a new future. But you have to choose to cross the line of faith. You have to choose to trust God in your pain. You have to choose to allow Jesus to come into your life so that his strength can be your strength, so that his joy can be your joy, so that his life can be your life. Jesus, who stood in his pain as he died on the cross for you, will give you the strength to stand in your pain. And by the way, the story doesn't end there. After Jesus was crucified, he rose from the dead. A pretty dramatic exclamation point that your pain is not the end of the story, that there's life after death, there's victory after defeat, there's joy after sorrow, there's healing after brokenness. And if you are here in this moment ready to entrust your life to Jesus, I want to lead you in a simple prayer where you can give your life to Jesus and he can bring his life to you right now. So in this moment, wherever you are, I just want you to pray with me this simple prayer, just one sentence. There's so much more you and God will talk about, but this is where it begins. If you're ready to give your life to Jesus, would you pray with me right now? Jesus, I give you my life. Right now, just tell him. Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, who died for you and rose from the dead, is waiting to give you the power of resilience as you stand in your pain. Jesus, the greatest warrior who ever lived, fought for your peace. This peace is waiting for you right now. Father, I want to thank you for everyone who in this moment has invited Jesus into their life. And for everyone who in this moment needs your peace. For everyone right now who's standing in their pain. And God, I just pray that in this moment, they would find the strength that only comes in you. That they would know that they are not alone in their suffering. They are not alone in their loneliness, and they're not alone in their brokenness. But you are the God who stepped into our pain, into our suffering, into our sorrow, into our brokenness, into our loneliness, and you conquered it all. And I pray, God, that even now you would set them free to live. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And I want to thank you guys for joining me from all over the world. I want to ask you to stay with us for a few moments because one of our pastors is going to come and they're going to give you some next steps as you begin your new journey with Jesus. And I want to encourage you to join me next week as we continue the path to inner peace. We're going to dive into different chapters of the Way of the Warrior, and I'm not doing it in sequential order. I'm going to take on each chapter based on what I think you need most in this moment of lockdown, quarantine, pandemic. In this moment of crisis, we're going to dive into the principles of this book. I want to encourage you to get into one of our Bible studies, get into one of our book clubs, and go deeper during the week so that God can actually actualize and activate these principles in your life. Thank you so much for joining us at Mosaic. God bless you guys, and I will see you next week.